Hey designers, welcome back to the studio. In this tutorial, we're going to do a little bit more of an investigation into how to work with a couple of design principles. The principles that we're specifically going to look at right now are sort of structured approaches to design that make use of two basic ideas. The first one, and maybe the easier of the two to kind of wrap your head around, is repetition and rhythm. This idea that we're going to use a structured repetition, not just kind of a random everywhere sort of repetition, but structured repetition that's scalable. We're going to use it to fill forms and also kind of just be a standalone. Now, balance is a little bit more difficult to understand on the surface, but when we talk about it in terms of symmetry, it tends to make a bit more sense. Now, not all balanced designs are symmetrical, but in this case, we're going to make some symmetrically balanced designs using both linear and radial symmetry. So let's actually come back to our pen tool tracing assignment and make use of some of these forms that we've already worked with. I'm going to work with this form down here, and it's just got some of these like basic geometric shapes as a standalone design, not the most interesting thing, but let's see what we can do with it by applying some of these design principles. I'm going to do a Command-C, Command-V, paste it down here. Now this design is made up of a bunch of individual pieces. If I want to kind of keep track of these as the design process goes, it's probably not a bad idea to do a Command-G or group. You could also do a right-click group. That works as well. Now, if I do an Option, click and drag, I'll pull that design straight to the side. If I have my smart guides turned on, you see how each one of these smart guides sort of highlights real quickly if I'm aligning to the center, aligning to the bottom. I can also hold Shift as it pulls straight across. Holding Shift makes sure that I can come straight across no matter how crazy my mouse is getting. It also pulls at sort of a 45-degree angle, right? It locks you into those dimensions. So I find that to be pretty handy. Pull that one straight across, right-click, transform, reflect. Now the two reflections we're going to use in this simple project will be a vertical reflection and a horizontal reflection. If you have your preview turned on, you can see the results in real time. Now I'll grab both of these designs together, pull them straight up, right-click, transform, reflect. This time I need that horizontal transformation. Just like our cut paper symmetry projects has two axes of symmetry, a vertical axis and a horizontal axis. Now I had a couple of other examples here, right, of working either with a slightly different rotation in the initial design, maybe even overlapping some of the designs. I isolated out specific pieces of the design. Each one of these follows the same basic two-axis symmetrical rule. Now, what about rotational symmetries? To do that, I'm going to come back over to this free space, and I'm going to grab out just a specific piece of this design, click into the group here, Command-C, and Command-V, paste. There are two techniques that I'll demonstrate for doing a symmetrical or rotational symmetry. It's not exactly the same kind of symmetry where it's a perfect fold, but you'll get a sense here of how this works. Effect, distort, transform, transform. This is the first technique that I'll demonstrate. And with preview turned on, I'm going to just put two fingers on the scroll pad, or you can use the wheel on your mouse to sort of scroll through these slider bars here instead of punching in specific numbers or instead of working with these sliders. I just kind of like to see the live effect. And I'm going to manipulate the angle. So far these transformations are pretty straightforward, but the magic starts when I start to make copies of that design. So a rotational symmetry in this case means that my design is being repeated around that circular axis. Now I'm going to start to lose the ability to see what's going on here, and there are a couple ways that I could resolve that. One of them is I could just kind of go with what I've got here in frame, or I could click cancel and zoom out a little bit, manipulate the size of my starter object. But instead of messing around too much in here, I just mostly wanted to kind of show you guys what's possible. I like this technique. It gives me a little bit of live feedback of what's happening, but it's not my favorite technique for doing rotational symmetries. But it does give me a couple of interesting options here beyond just what I've shown you so far. It allows me to sort of pivot this design on any one of these 9 axis, sort of rotational axis points. Each one of them is going to result in something a little different, and every time I click it, I get a little surprised at what's happening. I kind of like what's going on here. You notice that as I come all the way around, that my designs don't perfectly line up. I would end up, rotating 2 or 3 times before my design perfectly aligned. I don't love that. It's not a perfect rotational symmetry in that sense. Either way, I'm going to click OK on this. It's kind of nice. Anytime I apply a transformation like this, Illustrator doesn't think of it as multiple shapes. Here's another reason why it gets a little confusing to use the distort transform effect slider. You have to expand this object before Illustrator treats it like individual shapes. If I ungroup it, now I have access to each piece again. But there is another technique to doing rotational symmetries that I'll demonstrate, which I like a little bit better because of the precision and the sort of choices that I have, and it's using simply the rotate tool. So if I use keyboard shortcut R, I can reset the sort of rotational center of this shape. The first click with the rotate tool assigns the pivot point, and then the next click allows me to pivot it. Now with the rotate tool selected, if I hit Option, click, this allows me to do both. I can reset that center point and modify my angles. I'm going to use an angle here that goes into 180 degrees perfectly, and make sure that I do that rotate by copy. Command D is the keyboard shortcut for repeat, and this allows me to sort of repeat that design all the way around. And as I do that, it gives me a lot more control over what that design may look like. I'll come out here and do that one more time. This time using a rotational pivot point that's a little bit outside of the center. Use my rotate tool, Option, click. I'll do a 30-degree by copy, and Command D to repeat that all the way around. Now, it automatically sort of leaves these as individual shapes, which is something I really like about this technique, and it allows me to sort of work with many more pivot points than just the ones that the 9 options that the rotational symmetry allows. So working with different sizes of the design, different rotational centers, different scales, I can come up with all kinds of different rotational symmetries. Now finally, let's talk about pattern. There are 2 techniques that we can use to sort of generate pattern here in Illustrator. One of them is sort of the simplistic version, and one of them is a little bit more complex, and it allows us to sort of work with fills in an interesting way. Let's start with just this simple design again. Command C, find myself some white space. Command V, paste. And I sort of like this Z-shaped bit of cut paper design here. And as soon as I designed it, I thought, oh, I wonder if that would make for an easily repeatable design. What I'm going to do is turn on Smart Guides. With Smart Guides turned on, as I make copies of something, you'll see these sort of purple guides flashing as I move around. Now, one of my thoughts is that this design may just work as a linear pattern, and what I can do to sort of test that out is make a row of them, and they sort of look like they're fitting into each other. I can use the Align palette to make sure that they all sort of have the same amount of space in between them. If you don't have the Align palette open, go to Window, Align. Now a pattern should also be repeatable in 2 dimensions or in 2 directions, so I would need to find a way that this pattern can repeat sort of not just horizontally but vertically here. So it's possible that with a rotation this could work, and by kind of notching these together, it looks like this design is repeatable. Let me rotate this whole batch together and see what happens if I continue along that same design. So by playing with this design a little bit by hand, I've sort of come up with a repeatable pattern version of it. This is scalable, which means I could make it as small as I wanted to, or by copying large chunks of it, I could make it as large as I wanted to. The sort of spacing of a pattern like this can get a little bit tricky, but once you kind of get a block of it, just sort of treating each block as its own individual chunk, and then using the arrow keys to sort of tap those alignments out. With small inconsistencies in the seams, I can have that repeatable pattern expand over a large field. Now, there are other ways to work with that pattern, though, that are not quite as unpredictable. In fact, most designs will work either on a horizontal or a vertical grid or a hexagonal grid, and Illustrator has some of those things built in. So go to Window, Pattern Options. In pattern options, we're going to use this basic shape here to create a new pattern. If I click this little pancake stack in the pattern options window, I'll turn this into a pattern. And you can see that I'm going to be working also with my swatches panel. I'm going to kind of set that aside for a second and just work on my pattern itself, because so far this repeating pattern is not necessarily as interesting to me as the previous one. But let me show you how the pattern panel works, and we'll see if we can't get something more interesting. First of all, the grid pattern orientation here is sort of augmented by brick by row and brick by column and a few other sort of possible arrangements of this shape. I also have, if I kind of put two fingers on the trackpad here or use maybe the scroll wheel on the mouse, I can manipulate how those sort of successive patterns are going to line up. I do also have control over how this original design is rotated. So if I'm using the move tool, I can manipulate that shape in real time. That's really handy. If I go back to the grid, or maybe a grid by row, I can manipulate my offsets here. I can also, let's just say I realize that my design wasn't quite right, I could get a hold of the individual anchor points of my designs and begin to sort of tweak the design itself and see how every one of these patterns modifies itself in real time. I really like how much more freedom I have with this because I can preview what I'm seeing. I'm not quite as well practiced with this technique with the pattern making tool, but it's an exciting tool for me to start to play with. I'm sure that by working with it just a little bit more, I can probably come up with just as many interesting designs as the ones that I've designed by hand. Now, let me actually show you how this could work. If I want to sort of work with this design, if I click, just kind of click out here, come up to my options panel, I see that I'm working with kind of within a group here. It wants me to either save a copy, done, or cancel. I'm going to click done, and it looks like nothing happened. But here's how this works. If I take a shape, a circle, for example, and want to assign this fill to it, I come up to my swatches palette, which automatically popped open, but I kind of scooted it out of the way, and you see that I have this new pattern saved in there. If I click that pattern and set it to my fill, it automatically fills inside of that shape. I find this to be a really handy way to work with patterns that I don't typically have access to, just sort of building them out by hand. Even complex forms like the form itself that I was working with, I could reassign the fill so that it's a shape filled by its own pattern. I even like the idea that I can move it around and sort of custom manage what the edges are doing. Okay, so what's actually required for this assignment? Let me delete away some of these designs. What I want for you guys to turn in are a minimum of one linear symmetrical design, symmetrical designs where you folded over two axes. I want you to turn in one radial design, one design where you used radial symmetry, and one pattern that you made. You can use all the same shape like I did, or you can come up with different shapes depending on what you traced in your original design. I'm excited to see what you guys come up with. I'll catch up with you in the studio.